As we continue our study in the Gospel of John, let's think about the beliefs of the early readers. First, we'll look at the Greek side. This is a little bit philosophical. There's the issue of Docetism. In some Greek philosophical circles, going back to Plato many hundreds of years before, the physical world was evil in their minds. Goodness and holiness was found in the realm of ideas or spirit, or sometimes the realm of the logos. So perhaps that's why some sneered at Paul when he preached the resurrection in Athens in Acts 17:32. And if the physical world was evil, then the idea of God, the ultimate, pure, holy, good one, taking on human flesh, the incarnation, would have been very contrary to their mindset, especially probably the more philosophically oriented Greeks. So perhaps to bypass this difficulty, some Christian preachers began to teach that Christ only appeared to take on human flesh. He only seemed, or he only appeared to take on human flesh. In the 2nd century, after the Gospel of John was written, this idea became known as Docetism, from the Greek word dokeo, to seem. Docetism would then teach that God did not become a man. It only appeared that he did, using that Greek word dokeo. They said that the Christ only appeared to live in the land of Israel and only appeared to be crucified. These adherents of Docetism said that he, God, didn't really become a man. It was enough that his spirit, appearing like a man, came to serve us in this defiled world. He only seemed to eat bread and fish. So again, the word Docetism in our philosophical language comes from the Greek word meaning appearing or seems. For those thinkers, it was not possible that the holy God himself would really become a man in this unholy world. And it was not possible that God could put on the flesh of humanity in this dark world. Again, this is following the Platonic worldview in which idea and perfection were separated from this dark, dirty world, an impure world. So it's difficult to know when this teaching, the denial of the incarnation, began. There are no surviving records of Docetism in the 1st century. That doesn't mean it didn't exist. It just means we can't prove it did exist. Even so, sometimes in John's gospel, he does seem to refute that heresy. A spirit on the cross, for instance, the docetic idea of Christ, would not have blood and water come out of him when he was pierced in John 19:34. A docetic spirit at Jacob's well would not be weary on its journey in John 4:6, in John 1:14. And the logos, that was a word that these people would use about the pure, holy one of the idea in the realm of ideas. The logos became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory of the only unique one from the Father. That does sound like a direct attack on the idea that, he didn't really become humanity. It does seem like a direct attack of that. 1 John 1:1, what was from the beginning, which we have heard, which our eyes have perceived, which we have seen, and our hands have felt concerning the word of life. Again, those words sound like a direct refutation of this docetic idea. But did it exist in the 1st century? We don't really know. Did John intend to oppose some sort of pre-docetic teaching that he'd heard? Or is it just a coincidence that his gospel and letters do, in fact, counter the false teaching that would later come and be known as Docetism. Unless archaeologists uncover some first-century documents of Docetism, this will remain speculative. Now a word about Gnosticism. In the 2nd century, Gnosticism began to be widespread in Christendom, in Judaism, and in Greek thought as well. What was Gnosticism? It was a philosophical religious movement with many variations. It wasn't a standard. There wasn't a standard of pure Gnosticism. There was a lot of variation in Gnostic teaching. In about 170 AD, in his book Against Heresies, Irenaeus wrote against Gnosticism and its early advocate Cerinthus. Irenaeus records that the Apostle John went into a bathhouse in Ephesus, but when he heard that Cerinthus was in the bathhouse, he fled the bathhouse, saying, "Let us fly, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is within." Irenaeus also says that John wrote his gospel to counter the teachings of Cerinthus. But we actually don't have any of Cerinthus's writings. So even if Irenaeus' words are accurate, we still don't know exactly what John would have been opposing. If we read John 1 in the light of Gnosticism, we notice many similarities. The Gnostics and John use terms like word, logos, and light and world. Now, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered and examined, many scholars believe that John was strongly influenced by Gnosticism because he used those words. But it turns out that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, those same words, translated in Hebrew or Aramaic, of course, were often used, so that you couldn't say that the use of those words was proof of Gnostic influence. The Essenes, that are probably the ones behind the Dead Sea Scrolls, they weren't influenced by some Greek teaching way off in Greece. They were not interested in that. So an understanding of Gnosticism, with all its variations, would be important in the study of early church history, but its impact on the Gospel of John is dubious. Just a word about what Gnosticism is. Again, it's a very strange set of teachings with all kinds of variation, but the reason it's called Gnosticism, it's based on the word gnosis, which is the word knowledge. It's a word for knowledge in Greek. And the Gnostics taught in general that if you attained to this certain knowledge, then you would be saved. And they had a different definition of what being saved was, but it was an idea that there was a special knowledge for the elite. And some human beings would never gain this special gnosis, this special knowledge. But if you could get that knowledge, you could be saved. But again, there's a lot of variation in Gnosticism, and it's a convoluted study. And there is no evidence in the 1st century that Gnosticism even existed. Just because Paul or some New Testament author talks about knowledge and uses the word gnosis, it doesn't mean that he was referring to that philosophical system. So overall, John certainly wrote something that the Greeks could understand, even if what he said was different from their beliefs. In other words, the Gospel of John is an outstanding example of appropriate contextualization. He gave the good news with Greek words in ways the Greeks could understand, but his message was not modified to fit their beliefs. It's not a syncretistic document that lines up well with Greek philosophy, but it uses some terms that the Greek philosophers would know and understand. He never compromised his gospel as he presented the truths in words that these Greeks could understand. Gospel of John is a model of appropriate cross-cultural contextualization.